Hi, it's Tamara. In November 2023, the Washington Post published a series of photos from mass shootings across the United States. When I saw this, my mind immediately went to the survivors of those events, both those who had lost loved ones and those who were present for and injured by, physically and/or psychologically, the event. In a column entitled "Why We Are Publishing Disturbing Content from AR-15 Mass Shootings," the Post's executive editor, Sally Busby, wrote in part that, quote, "Our decision to publish this story came after careful and extensive deliberation among the reporters and editors who worked on it, as well as senior leaders in our newsroom. In the end," she continued, "we decided that there is a public value in illuminating the profound and repeated devastation left by tragedies that are often covered as isolated news events, but rarely considered as part of a broader pattern of violence." I encourage you to look up the column yourself to read more about who was consulted and the trauma training that journalists undertook. But while it was good to see that thoughtful consideration went into the publishing of these photos, for several months I couldn't shake the feeling that they still might be causing more harm than good. What impact might these images have on the potentially thousands of mass violence survivors who view them? What impact can they really have on the non-survivors, the average news consumers? I decided to reach out to Heather Martin. She's co-founder of the Rebels Project, a nonprofit that supports mass violence survivors. If you read my book, you'll know that Heather is also a survivor who was deeply impacted by the media coverage of her traumatic event. Here's our conversation.
Okay, Heather, why don't you just start out by introducing yourself?
Hi, my name is Heather Martin, and I am a Columbine survivor, and I'm also a high school English teacher.
Amazing. Okay, so usually, Heather, when I am speaking with trauma survivors about the media coverage of their experience, I'm asking them about the immediate aftermath. But for you, and as probably many listeners and viewers of this podcast will recall, the media was really a presence from the very unfolding of what you experienced in Columbine more than 2 decades ago. So to the extent that you're comfortable, what do you recall about the media that day?
Well, a very vivid memory for many, many years was the sound of the helicopter that was circling the school, which was a news outlet. Um, so the sound of helicopters used to be really, really triggering for me. I don't know how many years, but it was I would venture to say 5 or 6 years before, I could hear a helicopter without just making me anxious and nervous.
Mm-hmm.
Um, we also went to I'm trying to think of just that day. Um, when we were transported to Leawood Elementary School to essentially be like claimed by our parents, that was the reunification center that we went to. Um, the minute I walked out the door, I remember like having microphones and cameras shoved in my face and, asking questions. And I am 99% sure that like the answers that I gave were not accurate.
Mm.
So like I contributed to some of the misinformation because, I was 17 years old and traumatized and had no idea really what had happened while I was barricaded in the school. So, that led to misinformation.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and yeah, I think that was about it that day.
Like you
Uh,
you spoke to the media, if I recall from our previous conversations, that it was like you had been reunited with your dad, I think, right? Your dad was the one at Leawood,
mhm.
and you had microphones in your face like immediately after that. It was like, "Hey, dad," and you go outside and there's the media, right?
Right. I mean, it was like walking out of the school, like before we even, like geographically, my dad had to park, I would venture to say about a mile and a half away because all the streets were closed. So he walked from where his car was parked to Leawood Elementary School. And then somehow, I mean, right when we walked out of the elementary school, it was, um, yeah, right in our face. And very
Wow.
jarring. And like I said, my survivor friends, we kind of joke. I'm pretty sure I said something about like tanks and like
Yes, I
tanks
remember you
being
telling
there.
me that.
So I don't know.
Yeah, I remember you saying you telling me that that you had told a journalist that you had seen a military tank outside your school, but there was no tank. And I often refer to that story when I'm speaking with journalists about the misinformation. No, but like seriously, Heather, I could tell you so many stories of different survivors telling me things when their trauma responses were firing, and then them coming back to me later and being like, I have no idea, like after they've reviewed something, I have no idea why I said that. That is the opposite of actually the fact that I was trying to convey. And that's one of the reasons I tell reporters that they should show trauma survivors the stories before they go to air, before they go to print, like if for no other reason, considering like the survivor's mental health and all of that, then to make sure that your story is factually correct. So I appreciate you sharing that. Okay, so Heather, you and I have talked a lot about the idea of the physically uninjured survivor, which is what I would refer to you as. And I've spoken before about how we in the media like to treat the physically uninjured as mere witnesses to an event rather than victims and survivors of it. Was that your experience with Columbine? I mean, you experienced this great trauma, as you mentioned, being barricaded in the school, and then you're reunited with your dad and you're immediately interviewed about what happened.
I the fact that I was physically uninjured really impacted my recovery. In a sense that I didn't consider myself a survivor. To me, a survivor was someone who was physically injured. Um, and I don't even think I ever referred to myself as a victim either. Um, so I think that my own personal perception was also kind of skewed. Um, but I also think that that was amplified and like enhanced by the media's reaction and how they cover stories of people who have survived these events. The stories that sell, I guess, for lack of a better word, there's probably a better word for that, but
Mm-hmm.
are, those who were physically injured or, um, the victims' families and people who are in a lot of senses like closer connected.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but I wasn't in the room where a lot of the murders took place. I was in an office like catty corner to
Mm-hmm.
the library where um I think 9 of the killings took place. And in that sense, like my story didn't matter as much, even to like people I was telling my story to, or that people that knew, they were just felt, I think, like a little let down when I was like, oh no, I wasn't in the library, or no, I wasn't shot, like
Wow.
so it like I was already minimizing my own trauma and my own experience, and then that was amplified by society and the news media who they did come to my house a couple days later. I wish I could remember the
Mm-hmm.
exact day. It wasn't very long after the shooting, and interviewed like my family and my sister. It was my sister, me, my mom, and my dad. And again, like I was confused about what had happened, couldn't really remember what had happened. And it just seemed like my story, like I was a last resort, kind of like, oh, they
Mm.
couldn't get other people to talk. So I guess we'll talk to this
Oh.
family.
Do you recall, like, I can't imagine you remembering these sorts of details that far back, but do you recall any sense of the story being about you and what you experienced and like any part of your trauma? Or was it more so, we're here for you to tell us what happened that day to other people?
I don't remember, but my impression now is it was more about the event itself,
Yeah.
not about my experience. And I truly think that on VHS, that's how long ago this was. Like, I think
Yeah.
I have a copy of it somewhere.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, but I don't feel like it was centered on me or my sister for that matter,
Yeah.
because she was a freshman the year of the shooting, at all, and it was more about the event itself.
Right. Heather, when I spoke to you for my book, you talked about how there came a point for you that you realized that you just could not consume media coverage of any incident of mass violence. Are you comfortable talking about that?
Yeah, it took me a while to sort of figure that out. And the trajectory is that after what happened at Columbine, and kind of the misinformation that came out after that, and my mistrust of the media, um, after that event, I didn't watch the news at all. Like, I actually
Mm.
didn't have a TV. I lived with my roommate in this townhouse, and we never even bought a TV. It just wasn't something that interested us. And
But that was directly rooted in your like mistrust of the media.
yeah,
Okay,
like,
so
I
I
mean, I
feel like
wasn't a
we,
big like television watcher in general anyway,
right.
but why, like, I
So
just never
I
would watch it.
so I feel like we should pause there then and talk about first, like, where did your mistrust of the media come from after Columbine?
Well, it's kind of multi-pronged in that in the aftermath and trauma recovery, like, there's a lot of anger, and the anger gets directed in various ways. And for me, I directed my anger at the media. They would line the streets whenever we would go to like memorial events, even though we asked them to please leave us alone. Um, they, I mean, there's stories of them like sort of jumping out of the bushes at our graduation. Um, I
Because
remember
you were a senior that year, right?
I was a senior. Yep. So we
Right.
graduated 1 month later,
Okay. So in July of
and
that year.
May.
Or wait, oh, in May. Okay, I'm sorry. I thought you meant
Oh,
one
that's
month later
okay.
than you should have. Okay. So you graduated 1 month after the shooting happened. Wow.
hmm
Okay. And you have memories of the media sort of popping out of bushes.
Yeah, and we did a specific plea. It was 2 days later, and I only know that because my 18th birthday is April 22nd. So two
Mm.
days after the shooting, and we had a memorial planned at a local church, where we just wanted to see our classmates. Like, that was literally, we all just wanted to be in the same space together. And by classmates, I mean like the entire school of Columbine. So I wasn't part of the organization of the event, but some friends of mine were, and they specifically said, like, please, we are requesting no media. Like, we really just want to be with each other. And they didn't get into the space. They did not get into the church where we were meeting, but we had to park really far away. So we were walking down the road, and there's just like lines of cameras and journalists asking questions and shouting questions. And my sister says that that she just turned around and like spit in one of the cameras, like
Oh,
said, "Leave us
wow.
alone." I don't personally remember that. It was kind of a fog, but um, I also recall um, my parents' basement was kind of like the place where me and my friends would all hang out, probably because, we could like get into our own little bunch of trouble down there.
Hmm.
And
I think we can all recall the high school basement
right.
hangouts. Yeah.
My parents smoked, and like we all smoked, so we could like smoke in the basement
Oh,
freely.
yeah.
Um, but in the aftermath, we only wanted to be around each other, like people who had been through it with us. So we would sit in the basement, and like my dad would bring us pizza like every day, and we would read the newspaper and just like laugh and be angry at all of the misinformation. Like, I specifically remember reading in an article saying that there were 60 students hiding behind risers and robes in the choir room. Or maybe it was the music room is what they said. But and I remember being like, no, 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 there were 120 of us. Like, we were in the office, and maybe they were talking about a different room. I don't think anyone was in the room where they're,
Mm.
I mean, the risers aren't even a thing. They're always
Mm.
like put away aside from either way. So we were just like so furious. And so that's where all of my anger was directed.
Mhm.
It was at the media. The media couldn't get anything right. They, were talking to people and not stories of sort of like every day. And then there's, I think like the fracturing starts there, like some groups or people are getting a lot of attention and other groups and people like aren't. And it's wild.
Well,
It's wild.
I think that I don't even recall right now. It's been so long since I've read my own book, but I think that you and I talked about this, if not with you, then with other survivors, certainly. This was something that came up a lot in the mass violence survivor community, was that idea of a hierarchy that can be created, of a hierarchy of victims and survivors that can be created by the media, or at least amplified by the media. And is that sort of what you're referring to when you talk about the fractures and some people, becoming, for lack of a better word, like media darlings, while others might feel like, I wonder if that might be also where some of your, lack of validation might have come from too, where there's some people who are getting all the attention and it's like, oh, well, who am I to say that I suffered? Like, I didn't have that experience that they're putting all over the news.
I guess the short answer to that is like, yes, that is the kind of the fracturing that I'm talking about. There's other fractioning that's happening also kind of behind the scenes, but some of those stories are being published. And like I said already, that I was already feeling like my experience wasn't good enough or whatever. And so that did magnify it and it did make it worse.
Mm.
For years, it made it worse. It also hindered me from, I think, getting the help that I deserved or the help that I needed, because I was like, no, I don't, that help is for someone else. That help is for someone who deserves it, not me, not me, not me. Um, so there's a hierarchy, but it's also about our experiences and how we view ourselves and our trauma.
Yeah. And again, that's something that I've heard from so many others in the mass violence survivor community, where sometimes it's years and years before they get that mental health support that they need, because there hasn't been that recognition of the trauma, whether from the media or themselves or whoever else.
We'll be right back.
Okay, so let's get back to that then. So you're anti-media because of how they treated it. Basically, you don't have a television. You and your roommate don't have a television in your apartment. At what point did you realize that not only did you like not want to consume the media, but you actually like can't consume this sort of news coverage of these sorts of events?
Well, it started in 2001 when 9/11 happened. As I mentioned, we didn't have a TV. I had no idea it had happened. So I was like driving to work that morning and it was all over the radio, and that, like, I'm very lucky that I did not like kill myself or kill someone else on the road getting to work, because I don't remember getting to work. I remember sort of stumbling into my manager's office. I worked at a restaurant, and being like hyperventilating and having this like horrible anxiety attack, but not being able to explain why I was having it because I wasn't really sure at the time. But I think I probably like got out, I went to Columbine. I don't know what's wrong with me. And then like tried to crawl behind the ice machine to like hide. And, some of the other employees showed up and kind of eventually got me out from behind the ice machine. But I didn't then watch any footage really of that, aside from some of the like memorials
Hmm.
or memorial events. Um, and then fast forward a few years to the shooting at Virginia Tech. Um, Someone either texted me or somehow I got word, like don't watch the news. And I was like, oh man, like something's happened. And so I of course watched the news. I put it on and I just coincidentally turned it on at the very time that the network was showing the perpetrator's manifesto, which he had mailed in. And so they were playing the manifesto, and I, like I said, just coincidentally caught the part where he named the perpetrators from Columbine, or at least mentioned Columbine. And I was like, oh my gosh. So I saw some of that footage, and it probably took 2 days before I fully digested what I had seen and what I had heard, and I had a horrendous anxiety attack. I had to call into work. Um, the same company. I was actually working for the
Oh,
same
wow.
company and had to explain myself, which is horribly embarrassing because, people expect you to be over it in whatever imaginary timeline that they make up, but I wasn't, and it was still impacting me, and I had to like tell them that I couldn't come into work because of this. And luckily, like they were very kind about it and understanding, but I was mortified and also didn't fully understand it. It was like, why is this happening to me? Like I don't get it.
Hmm. So from then on out, is it safe to say that you continued to actively avoid media coverage,
Yes.
period?
So I think since Virginia Tech, I have not followed anything live, that's for certain. But I don't even really read up on many of the details
Hmm.
because I don't trust them. I don't
Hmm.
trust the details in the aftermath. If I hear about like the details of a specific event, I hear about it from a survivor.
Hmm.
Um, and that's how I will learn, like I can do like kind of umbrella detail or not like
Hmm.
overview.
Yeah.
Um, but I mean, I remember specifically asking someone like, so what happened to the Sandy Hook shooter? Like, I don't even know.
Hmm.
Um, it
You didn't
just,
know if he was dead or alive.
yeah, and I just, I knew that my reaction would be to me embarrassing and horrible and not good for me. And so I haven't watched footage since.
Yeah. And before, like, I want to ask you, Heather, if this is a common sentiment that you hear from mass violence survivors, but just to add some context to that, is it okay if we mention the Rebels Project, which you're a co-founder of?
Yeah.
Can you maybe tell us a little bit about the Rebels Project? Because first of all, it's an amazing organization that as I mentioned, you're a co-founder of, but also because it can help us with some insight into where you've gathered some of your insights from over the years.
So let's see. In 2012, there was a shooting at a theater in Aurora, and basically my friend Jen texted me like the next day and was like, "Hey, what do you think about starting a support group for mass shooting survivors?"
Mhm.
And Jen was also class of 99, barricaded in the choir room with me also. And I was like, "Yeah, I'm in." So within days, we had like sort of started like a Facebook group. Like that kind of support, but we started planning our first support meeting. Um, and have been operational ever since. We have monthly support meetings. We have one of the largest online private survivor networks. We are international because we have members from outside of the United States. I think Sweden, Canada, Ireland, trying to remember the other countries. Um, but the online forum has about 2,500-ish members
Wow.
from upwards 170 different survivor communities. We hold monthly support meetings. Um, we used to flip them like in person and then online and in person and online. The in-person ones were always in Colorado. Now they're mostly virtual. We have an annual survivor retreat where we basically, fund as many survivors as we can afford to come out to Colorado for a weekend to be together. And just like hanging out in my parents' basement in the aftermath, it was like being around people who got it and who
Yeah.
understood what you'd been through and weren't going to judge you for your reactions or your experience.
Hmm.
Frankly, we rarely talk about our actual experiences in the group, in support meetings. It's almost exclusively about recovery and how recovery looks for different people.
Hmm. How does I first I'll ask you, like, because I'd asked you before about your consumption of the media coverage of these sorts of stories, but is that a common sentiment that you hear from survivors that, they avoid the media?
Um, I wouldn't say it's super common. I have found that many survivors get really sucked in to the coverage and watch it and absorbed in it, and it's really, really hard. We had a discussion in the group about like giving trigger warnings, like, hey, avoid the news, or, keep an eye out for this. And some people argued that, we shouldn't do that because then people will immediately look at the news and will immediately start searching.
Mm.
And we had like a good conversation thread about it where essentially, like, ultimately we decided that to be mindful of your trigger warnings, like
Mm.
about why you're giving it. Are you giving it to help other people or so that you're looking for some kind of support because something has happened?
Uh,
And we found that most of the time when people do give that warning, it's because they are struggling. Like
yeah,
they've seen it, they're struggling, they don't want other people to struggle.
right.
So just you can word it a little bit differently. Um, but we decided to keep them and like allow people to post that because as sad as it is, like we have to live in this world. Like we have to figure out how to survive in this world. And if consuming media in the aftermath is bad for you, then hopefully you can find a way to navigate that in a healthy way.
Mhm. I guess everybody has to find what is healthiest for them, right? Because every survivor's journey is different.
Yeah,
Um,
so different.
something else I've heard from mass violence survivors, Heather, is the need to not be surprised by images of their perpetrator. I know there's been lobbying by some survivors, for example, to not have a perpetrator's photo used as that little thumbnail image that would appear on like a news outlet's main webpage, or as the main image for that matter. What impact can something like that have on a survivor if they're maybe going to the news website to just check, the results of the Super Bowl, though I can't imagine anybody needing to look at just the next day's news for that, or the weather, whatever, and then suddenly they see that mugshot of the perpetrator. What sort of impact can that have?
It's really jarring. It's really scary. In particular for people who saw the perpetrator during their event. I did not see the perpetrators at Columbine, but I did grow up with them, like I knew them. And it's, yeah, I don't love it. I think I've become a little bit desensitized to it because of the work that I do. There's pictures of the Columbine perpetrators all over the place. You really can't get away from it.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but I think also what that adds is like a sense of notoriety for them
Mm-hmm.
so that they are more recognizable. And I know this happens with other communities, but I can only speak specifically for the Columbine community in that people create fake Facebook profiles. People like idolize our perpetrators so much that, I mean, they'll friend request us. We get like really weird like texts, like
Oh my
actual text
gosh.
with like our addresses and that they're coming to finish the job.
Oh my
Um,
goodness.
it's very scary.
Oh.
So I think that by keeping the names and the images of the perpetrators out as much as, feasibly possible, um, can help decrease instances of that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm so sorry that you've experienced that, and the other Columbine survivors, Heather. I can only imagine how awful that would be to get those messages. I have heard about and read the research behind the so-called media contagion effect, where the actions of one perpetrator and the sort of infamy that follows will then inspire the actions of the next one. And that's why I have advocated for not identifying perpetrators of mass violence where possible. But to know that people would also be using that information and to further intentionally victimize those who have already been victimized is awful. Speaking of images, Heather, I reached out to you recently because I'd been thinking about a series that had been published recently, or in recent months anyway, by the Washington Post. And as I mentioned to you, I've just been like, stirring this around in my head over and over again, how I felt about this, because I just felt it didn't feel good in my gut. This was a series that included several never before seen graphic images that had been captured by law enforcement, usually in the immediate aftermath of mass violence events. And the Washington Post justified the use of these images with a note from the executive editor that said in part, quote, "Most Americans have no way to understand the full scope of an AR-15's destructive power or the extent of the trauma inflicted on victims, survivors, and first responders when a shooter uses this weapon on people." So when we last spoke off air, you had purposely not looked at the images, and I assume that this is still the case. But I am still curious, Heather, as to your reaction to them being published in the first place.
I would be interested to hear the conversations that happened, to justify that decision. I don't think, to me, there's no reason why the picture of a mutilated body would make a difference when in the person that it's intending to make a difference for.
Mm.
Again, I am not the audience for that particular news article. That's not something, like, it's not written for me. Like, you don't have
Yeah.
to convince me of the,
That mass shootings are
horribleness that
wrong,
these.
that there's a problem. Yes.
Yeah, so it's for somebody else.
Yeah.
And I think that somebody else's, a a group of those somebody else's, like, that's not going to make any difference at all. Like, I don't, and I don't know. I I don't love it. I can't really judge it 100% like the choice,
Mhm.
because I assume that they talk to the families.
Mhm.
And if that's a choice that the family makes, like, I would support their choice.
Mhm.
Absolutely. Um, but I will, like, I'm not going to read that, and I'm not
Mhm.
going to, well, I'm not going to look at those images. That is not, like, I don't, not to get like I've seen that in person. Like,
Yeah.
I don't have to see pictures of it
Yeah.
to be convinced of anything.
And I will note, like, the Washington Post, they had a lot of coverage, I would say, around the publishing of these pictures. I recall reading one story where they pointed out that there was mixed reaction, including from within the survivor community, that there was one survivor, I believe, that had said, like, "Why would you do this? This is so harmful for you to show these images. We don't want to see this." Whereas another said, I think the family of a child who had been killed said, like, "Yes, people need to see this. They need to understand, so it doesn't help anymore." So it is a divisive issue, obviously, which is why they would have had to be very thoughtful about it. But at the same time, clearly it can cause harm to some people. So I wanted to ask you to weigh in on that for that reason.
We'll be right back.
But at the same time, also, Heather, like, these photos, as I mentioned, they weren't simply published. Regarding the conversations in the newsroom that happened around it, similarly, in 2022, there had been a reporter for the Chicago Sun-Times who had happened to be at a 4th of July parade in Illinois when several people were killed. And the Chicago Sun-Times chose to publish only one photo, one of several photos that the reporter had taken, and they placed it behind a digital screen that had a warning on it that read, and I'll read from it, quote, "This image is graphic and disturbing, depicting dead bodies moments after the shooting at Highland Park. Please consider the potential for trauma and exercise caution and self-care in deciding whether to view it." So then readers then had to choose to click into the photo to view it. And I wonder, Heather, like, does the apparent quote unquote thoughtfulness that is going into publishing these photos give you any hope, or lessen any of your potential concern about them being published, or about the media coverage of these sorts of cases in general?
Um, I don't know if can't think of, like, hope per se, but I've had like the idea of becoming trauma informed in lots of different fields. And I know that it can become like a buzzword at some point. I mean it already
Yeah,
has,
yeah,
truth.
absolutely.
But like that's just like a responsible thing to do. Like I don't like
Hmm.
why would you just publish, like that is quote unquote thoughtful, but also like it's a pretty low bar for like
Hmm.
thoughtfulness, like,
Yeah.
oh, I just don't want to be exposed to like, and like I remember some pictures of that came out of the Route 91 shooting, or some brief images that would show up, and it was of people sort of like fleeing or whatever. And as a survivor and seeing pictures of myself like fleeing the event, like that's forever. And now everybody is seeing it. And what if that is your loved one's body that is just all over the news and that everybody is seeing it? And what if it comes out before you even know? What if that's how you find out? Like, I can't, I mean,
Hmm.
now I'm sort of like spiraling in my head. I'm like, and
No.
what if? And what if?
No,
Uh,
but the whole the idea of like those images, they spiral out of control now because like something that's different from the 90s when your mass violence event happened and the Harvest One Music Festival, for example, is the instantaneousness of this information being disseminated because of social media, right? Although it was pretty instantaneous in your case too, with mainstream media, broadcasting live outside and whatnot. But you're absolutely not alone in sharing that. And I actually think that one of those videos, if I recall, is one that was used in that series that I was referring to from the Washington Post, where you can actually hear the gunfire. And I mean, that in and of itself can be, it can really fire those trauma responses for survivors as well, right?
yes, I remember. Actually, I'd forgotten this until just now, but I was scrolling through social media, probably Facebook or something, and it was after um the Bataclan shooting in
Oh,
France,
right. Yeah.
and happened upon like someone had released images of like the massacre in there. And I knew even the moment that I saw like scrolling through, I knew it was real. Like I knew it was real. And I was absolutely horrified and like started shaking and went to my husband because I couldn't even like find the block function or like how to keep. It's like, I need your help. I need your help. And he's like, oh my gosh, yes. What do you need? And I was like, you need to block this person and like get rid of these for me. Like I can't think straight right now. And so being like blindsided by stuff like that is, yeah, it's not great.
And that is a message not just for the media, which will disseminate some of those images and videos in the immediate aftermath, but for people in general, right? Like we live in a society right now where a lot of people think that, if I didn't record it, it didn't happen. And it's like when something out of the ordinary happens, their first instinct is to take out their cell phone camera, record it, and then share it or share it simultaneously live, right? But it can be seriously harmful, as you just illustrated. And thank you for sharing that, Heather. Okay, so we talk a lot on this podcast about the potential for harm from the media's coverage of traumatic events, but what about the potential for healing, Heather? Because that is a big focus of the Rebels Project. There's this term post-traumatic growth, which I've heard from various people when I look around this subject. And you and I have discussed this off air. Perhaps you could speak about that a bit and what role the media could play in a survivor's post-traumatic growth after a traumatic incident.
Well, I've learned a lot in my years as, I mean, not only a survivor, but having an organization that supports survivors and kind of relying on the media to help us get the word out about our organization. Because we're very private people. Survivors are in general, because I think that our experiences have been exploited so often. Um, so yeah, we rely on the media to help us get word out about the Rebels Project in general. Um, and that has been extremely helpful. Like we are still around, and now we do less and less interviews because we don't need the publicity anymore. A lot of people
Mm.
are finding us word of mouth. Um, and I think so another part that the media can play, I mean, but sharing information, like helpful information, is helping to tell the stories of survivors from the survivor's point of view. And I don't understand all of the things that go into, like, I'm not a journalist, but, you know, I've often done like an hour interview and then it gets cut down to like 45 seconds. Um, And the part of me, I totally understand that. Like, and you know what? I appreciate when the person like gives me a heads up. They're like, hey,
Hmm.
just so you know, we're gonna have to cut this down. I'm like, I know, but it still like hurts my heart a little bit.
Well, and that's such a
Um,
common sentiment. Like so many survivors have told me that they didn't realize that that hour-long conversation or even 20-minute conversation would be reduced to one or two or three quotes or clips in the story, right? Can you
yeah.
expand on that, Heather? Like, how does that make you and survivors feel when you've sat and you've exposed that, very emotional part of you quite often, or talked about this very big heavy thing that was part of your life, and then it's like the journalist can pick, okay, this is the important part that is going to make it into the story.
Well, I mean, it minimizes the experience, and which in turn only amplifies what we feel on the inside because we are already fighting with ourselves. Why am I not over this? Why am I so impacted? Why am I so like questioning all these things? And then it's just narrowed down to like that sound bite or, the quote that you don't love. It's like, oh, they
Mhm.
picked that quote. Oh, that's the worst one. Um, and I think like going into it, like now the things that I've learned, man, and
What
it's
have you learned?
usually like so the conversations that I have before agreeing to do an interview of any kind, I always give like the non-negotiables. These are the things that I won't talk about.
Hmm.
I never would have thought of that years ago. I never would have thought to just like lay it out there from the start.
Hmm.
Um, so I give like my non-negotiables and then I give them an urging, like I urge you not to name the perpetrators.
Hmm.
And I would suggest you try this. I recently was having a conversation with a journalist who's doing a story on the upcoming 25-year mark of the events at Columbine High School. And I I don't know. I think I used to maybe just not be afraid to like say it, but I just was like, "Hey, just so you know, we prefer that if you call it a year mark instead of an anniversary, if you could help spread that."
Hmm.
Um,
Tell me about
Personally,
that.
I
You're
refer
because I've heard
myself
that
as a
before.
survivor, but
Okay.
but I have also heard other people want to be called warriors,
Oh,
because
okay.
they think survivor is disrespectful to those who were killed.
Hmm.
Um, I personally think that victims are the people who were killed.
Hmm.
Uh, and I did an interview where this was a few years ago. I can't remember what year, and it was a very large publication, a national publication that misquoted me and said victims this and victims that. And I right away, as soon as I read it, I sent a message that was like, this is not a quote from me. I would never say victims here. And
Did you, is this something that they sent you ahead of time to look at, or
no,
this? Oh,
no, I
you
saw
saw
it.
it online, or?
Yeah, well, they shared the link with me. Like, hey, this just went live. Here, read this. So I read it and I was like, no, I would never say this. And then I started doubting myself. I'm like, maybe I did say it. Like, I've been a little traumatized. Like, it was after like another shooting had happened in Colorado. So I was doing an interview and then I was just like, no, I did not say this. And so they went back and listened to the recording because they recorded it and they were like, oh yeah, I misquoted you. I'm like, I know. Like,
oh
I
my
know.
gosh.
Like, and they
But
changed it
meantime,
and
you're
it,
probably thinking, how many people are reading this and thinking that this is what I say, and it's so important to me that I don't use this language. Is that fair to say?
yes. And like I I actually just got back from Washington, D.C. and spoke with some staff there where I was like, hey, the 25-year mark is coming up. Like, please do not refer to it as an anniversary. Like, we call it the year mark. and people are open to hear, like, they're not like, oh, I can't believe you would tell me that. Like, everyone that I've said that to has been super grateful. They've been like,
Yeah,
thank you so much for letting us know. Like, we
for
appreciate
sure.
that. And like, I've never had someone like not honor it.
Yes. No, I've been, that's actually something I mentioned in my book because there was a homicide survivor that said the same thing to me. Don't use the word anniversary. And I had just used it because I had never thought anything of it. But her reasoning was, we think of anniversaries as happy events, but this is not a happy event. Is it fair to say that that would be the same reason for you, that you wouldn't want the term anniversary used?
Similar, yes, very. Like, anniversaries are typically something to be celebrated.
Mhm.
I do think that you can honor an anniversary as well. Um, but again, I just prefer the more neutral, like, year mark.
Yeah.
There's a group of survivors that call it a tragiversary or a
Mm.
traumaversary. Um, that's too much of a mouthful for me, I think. I'll like slip up all the time.
Yeah.
But I just prefer the year mark. Like,
Yeah.
it's the year mark, and it's the 10-year mark, the 11-year mark, the 12-year
Yeah.
mark. And we're coming up on our 25-year mark.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing that. Because again, it's such a simple but very powerful lesson around like the importance of language that we use in stories and words, and asking survivors or victims or warriors how they want to be identified, and not necessarily assuming that the words that you use will fit into the way that they identify themselves. Okay, so all of that said, Heather, what would you like to see reporters focusing on when covering incidents of mass violence? You mentioned the narratives of survivors that are really from the perspective of the survivor. But I just wonder, you not being a journalist, I want you to tell me, like, ideal world, how do reporters cover these events responsibly from the outset?
Well, I think that focusing on positive imagery, and when I say positive, obviously the event is not positive.
Mhm.
Um, but let's see, how can I put this in a so when I'm triggered by something, my body freaks out, like my heart starts pounding, I start sweating and shaking and whatever. That's what happens when I see images from like an event that are traumatizing or triggering to me. When I see images from an event that are from the memorials, or people hugging, or like coming together, or the ribbons, like that sort of honeymoon phase that happens
Mhm.
afterward, that makes me cry. And the way I think about that is, since I've been in therapy, like, crying is great. And it's very, like, cleansing, and feelings are good. The bad feelings are the triggering, the
Yeah.
shaking, the sweating, the anxiety attacks.
The
So
tears are part of the healing.
yeah, and so when I see these healing images, or these, like, quote unquote positive images,
Mhm.
that makes me tear up and choke up, but in a good way.
Mhm.
Um it brings back horribly sad memories, and like it chokes me up for like a very sad reason.
Yeah.
But that's different than, my heart pounding, and like, getting carted off in an ambulance because I think I'm having a heart attack when it's an
Yes.
anxiety attack. Like,
Yeah.
those are very different emotionally or like physical responses from my body. So I think that journalists, maybe if you're thinking about it in that way, the imagery can be from memorials. And I mentioned that after 9/11, like, I didn't watch anything except for I watched, it was like a concert for heroes, I think it
Mhm.
was. And specifically I watched it because I knew Bruce Springsteen would be on it, and he was the opener. And I still, like, have that mental image in my head, and a positive connection to seeing that. Like, I
Mhm.
don't need to see the images from 9/11 to
Mhm.
be impacted and to feel, I don't wanna say the horror, but, like, the depth of that day. I don't
Mhm.
I don't know if that is a
No,
little
I
silly, but
I think it makes sense because there is so much emotion involved in those memorial type events. Um, and you're right, like when you think about some of the images that come out of these horrific events, like those are the images that like shock us to our core, right? And it can, for survivors, I imagine, like it's what can bring you into the moment. Like somebody is living that right now. And it's like when I was living it right in that moment. But, you know, the emotional stuff that happens after the healing part, it doesn't take away the pain of what happened, but it's not that visceral type of, you know, panic pain. Is that sort of what I'm hearing from you?
Yes, I think that is much more succinct than what I
No,
was
the way you
rambling
worded it was
about.
really good, but you know, it's the like a number of survivors, that mass violence survivors that filled out one of my surveys, like back when I was doing my research a few years ago, they did specifically mention images of people with terrified looks on their faces, not wanting to see those images. Like that was specific. And there is a clip that I use from another mass violence survivor, Rachel Maurice, in one of the workshops that I give, where it's like I ask journalists, like, what do you think of as a very graphic photo in the immediate aftermath? And, you know, most of them will say body bags or bodies under blankets or blood, that sort of thing. And then I play the clip from Rachel where she's describing the image of her leaving her school with her hands above her head. Like for her, that was a graphic image that had a really negative impact on her. But then there was another photo of her that was published sometime later at a memorial from behind, from a respectful distance. And seeing that photo years after the fact actually brings her peace. Like it helps in her healing journey. So it's completely in line with what you're describing, Heather. You've sort of already touched on this one. It's the question I ask almost everyone on this podcast in terms of what does the term trauma-informed journalism mean to you? But is there anything else you'd like to say on that, or anything else that we've talked about for that matter, Heather?
I think it's really important to listen to like people in your community. So just like I listen to people in my community for like how we feel about certain language, things like that. Journalists have a unique job where, you know, you're listening to someone else tell their story. Um, but you can also listen to other journalists who are in your field and learn from them as well. And I particularly know a few journalists who have covered several mass violence events. Um, and they speak about how you can do it responsibly. And like I mentioned before about this idea of like being trauma informed, but also just doing it responsibly. Like, what are the responsible ways for humankind that you can share these stories and you know, with integrity for both you and the person and the event that you're covering.
Mm-hmm. For you, would that have meant, you know, not having a reporter outside that elementary school in the immediate aftermath? Would it have meant not having the media outside your high school as it was going on? What would responsible journalism have looked like for you?
I would love to say yes, and I will say yes, but I also can't go back in time and figure out how that would have changed the trajectory of my healing
Mm.
because it's been 25 years. Um, like my perspective is very, very different.
Mm.
And I know that we all know that this statement is not true, that like time heals all wounds, but what time does do, like it doesn't heal all wounds, but
Mm-hmm.
what it does do is it provides time. And now I have time to figure out how I react to certain things and time to figure out who I am after the event because I'm not the same person that I was before. So I would love to say that that would have changed it, and I assume it would have. It would have given me some validation. It would have made me maybe less judgy of myself and my emotions and how I was traumatized. Um it also would have kept me from being terrified at somebody jumping out of the bushes at me.
Mm.
uh but like,
Last thing you need to be thinking about at your high school graduation.
right? Like, oh my goodness. um so like I don't know, it's like this weird like juxtaposition between like journalists have such an opportunity to help people with their post-traumatic growth. Um And also, like, I don't think it can actually be measured. So you just have to be responsible. I don't know.
Mhm,
Listen to
mhm,
survivors and listen to your fellow journalists who are doing the work.
mhm. Wonderful. Heather, one more question for you. Where can people learn more about the Rebels Project and the wonderful work you do and donate? Because that's what you guys run on, donations, right?
We do. So we are, I'm a high school English teacher. So we are all survivor led. We are all volunteers. None of us like take a salary from it. So we do um survive on donations alone. And you can find us at therebelsproject.org and read up about some of the programs that we offer. And you can also donate there as well.
Amazing. Yeah, and maybe send somebody to one of those annual retreats that you guys have. That sounds wonderful.
Yeah, you can like sponsor a survivor. It's one of our
Per-
programs.
Perfect. Amazing. Okay. Heather Martin, thank you so much for your time. Pleasure as always speaking with you.
Thank you so much for having me.